A 48-year-old famous actor and investor stepped into the luxury hotel he helped establish, but was told, "The rooms are full, only guests are allowed." He didn't argue. He quietly made a phone call, and everything changed. He didn't want anything flashy. He didn't want a crowd of fans. All he wanted was a key, some peace and quiet, and a calm night before his morning meeting. Actually, he hadn't planned to come in person, but when Mark Ruffalo walked through the revolving doors of the Oakmark Grand Hotel in Iowa, things didn't go as expected. He walked with a quiet confidence that didn't draw attention. His dusty sneakers were silent. His dark jeans and gray t-shirt were neat but simple. He had an old backpack on his back. He had no assistant or entourage. He looked like an ordinary traveler or someone trying to blend in. At the front desk, a young clerk chewed on the end of a pen, her acrylic nails tapping on the keyboard. She looked up and greeted him with a casual smile. It was the kind of automatic smile reserved for guests. Mark smiled politely. "For Ruffalo." The clerk's fingers paused on the keys. He narrowed his eyes and pursed his lips. There's no reservation under that name." Mark shook his head. "No problem. They usually set aside a suite for me. I'm afraid all our rooms are booked tonight. Only guests with confirmed reservations can check in." His tone had changed. Mark's smile didn't fade, but the atmosphere shifted. His eyes drifted to the gold plaque behind him. Oakmark Grand, a Ruffalo partnership. So the name wasn't just on the reservation, it was on the building. "I'm a guest," he said quietly, "and I'm one of the investors in this hotel." The clerk blinked. Mark looked at him as if he'd said, "I'm Bruce Banner," surprised and skeptical. Then the young attendant's lips curled into a skeptical smile. "Are you the owner of Oakmark?" he asked. Mark shook his head slowly. "Stay calm," the girl said, her voice taking on a more official tone. She reached for the phone on the desk and began dialing for the manager. "Please wait." On the other side of the lobby, a couple wearing golf shirts whispered something to an elderly man sitting by the fireplace. The man lowered his gaze. Mark noticed it. That familiar, unsettling weight. The "we know who you are" look. A few seconds later, a man with a crooked tie emerged from the side door, carrying a file. His name tag read Assistant Manager Neil Dorrance. Neil glanced at Mark and then spoke with a forced smile. "Good evening. Is there a problem with your reservation?" Then the receptionist said in a slightly raised voice, "He claims to be the owner of the hotel." Neil hesitated for a moment. Mark looked directly at him. "I'm not claiming to be," he said calmly. "My name is Mark Ruffalo. It's in your reports, investment documents, and even at the opening ceremony for this building. A suite should have been reserved for me tonight." Neil adjusted his glasses. "Just a moment," he said, leaning toward his walkie-talkie and muttering something as he walked toward the back. Mark didn't move. He didn't panic, didn't raise his voice. But the air in the lobby grew heavy. At that moment, two security guards appeared. Their hands in their pockets, they positioned themselves calmly, but with a clear message. One by the elevators, the other at the corner of the coffee bar. Mark didn't look away. He wasn't afraid, but a familiar fire was rising in his chest. It wasn't because they didn't recognize him, but because they still didn't accept that he was supposed to be there. He could have taken out his wallet and shown his ID. He could have shown his property documents, contracts, photos from the opening. But he knew this wasn't just about a room, so he said nothing. He stepped back, took his phone out of his pocket, and made a single call. While those around him were still trying to figure out what was happening, he simply moved to a corner. Standing at the base of a marble column, phone pressed to his ear, he waited motionless. The call lasted only 26 seconds. No explanation was needed. He didn't need to say much. He didn't even raise his voice. He simply stated his location and name. "My investment in the property has been rejected. This issue needs to be resolved immediately." Then he hung up and returned to the front desk. The clerk continued typing furiously on the keyboard, as if pressing the keys a little harder might change the facts. Neil returned a few minutes later with a file in his hand. He was visibly tense, but when he saw that Mark was still waiting calmly, he changed his tone. "Mr. Ruffalo," he said, emphasizing his last name clearly, "I think there's been a mix-up. We just need to verify a few things." Mark interrupted him politely but firmly. "Verify whatever you need. I'm not going anywhere." Neil turned away without making eye contact and looked at the security guard. The staff didn't know what to do. Should they step back, apologize, or wait silently? Every option seemed threatening. The atmosphere in the lobby was tense. Three women sitting by the window covered their mouths and whispered, while a young man pretended not to listen, hunched over his laptop. The doorman no longer greeted anyone. Mark noticed the receptionist slide her hand under the desk. She was checking her phone. It was clear she was searching for a name. She probably wasn't expecting a response. But for Mark, this scene was a familiar cycle. People think they know how power dresses, yet someone who arrived in an old t-shirt, a backpack, and a clean-shaven face would never be perceived as authority. This was what he had been facing for years. And suddenly he remembered that night in Milwaukee. He was 28 years old. He had just been assigned there. He wasn't wearing heels, but his shoes were cheap. His suit was 2 sizes too big because that was all he could afford. Security had been following him from the moment he stepped into the hotel. His salvation came when the company's CFO came down to greet him. He had never forgotten that day, and now, 20 years later, he was still in a building where his name was on the documents, on the walls, even on the plaque at the entrance. And he was still having to prove who he was. He took a deep breath. His eyes scanned the room. There was no apology yet, no explanation, just the ticking of a clock and people trying to look away without drawing too much attention. Then the elevator bell rang. 2 men stepped out. One was wearing a gray suit and carrying a file. The other was wearing the company's polar fleece jacket, but neither of them looked like classic hotel staff. Their steps were determined. Mark recognized them immediately. They were Regional Vice President Brent Kessler and Regional Manager Carlos Reno. The first signs of panic were visible on their faces. As Brent approached, he nodded sharply at Neil without saying a word. "Mr. Ruffalo, we're very sorry. I just received the news," he said in a low voice. Carlos quickly added, "We're handling it immediately." Neil opened his mouth, but Brent's glance made him swallow his words. The receptionist stood motionless. His eyes seemed to pop out of their sockets. And then he realized who they were talking to. His face drained of color. He quietly backed away. Carlos spoke, looking at his tablet. "Suite 12 is currently available. Your driver will be ready in the morning. Your usual fruit platter and espresso order have been sent to your room." Mark smiled slightly, but his eyes were still watching. What really interested him was how these people would change after learning who he was. Their voices, their posture, their words. He wanted to see how the air would change when power entered the room. It's one thing for people to be disrespectful when they don't know you. But even after they get to know you, that's a whole different story. Carlos quietly pulled Neil aside. His tone was low but sharp. Brent was already on the phone. He was firing off quick sentences about human resources, violation procedures, and corporate reports. And the tension directed at Mark was now sinking into them. Like a pinball, stress was bouncing around among the hotel staff. But Mark didn't move. He didn't cross his arms. He didn't smile like he'd won. He didn't lift his chin. Because this wasn't a race. It was just being accepted as normal. He returned to the front desk with slow, quiet steps. He placed his phone on the counter. "I'll take the suite on the 12th floor," he said. "Same arrangement. Please send someone to make sure the room is ready." The receptionist opened his mouth, but no words came out. Mark noticed he was trying to speak, but didn't wait. He turned to Brent. "Is the check-in complete?" Brent flipped through the file in his hand and nodded. "It was just done. When you get on the elevator, 2 key cards and an incident report will be ready for you. Got it?" Mark nodded slightly. "What about the rest?" Brent spoke in a more serious tone. "A general briefing has been sent to the entire facility. The corporate audit team is on its way. All staff will be recertified on guest protocol. The disciplinary process begins tonight." Mark turned his eyes to the receptionist. He was now biting his lips. His acrylic nails were tapping the table, but not indifferently like before. He was tense. "I'll talk to him," Mark said quietly but firmly. Brent cleared his throat. "Of course. Human resources will be ready as well." Carlos looked like he was about to say something, but Mark raised his hand slightly. "Not now, after he's had a chance to rest." He took his key cards, bowed slightly, and headed toward the elevator. Eyes followed him. Whispering began. No one spoke to him directly, but everyone had noticed him. When the elevator doors closed, he caught a glimpse of Neil. He hadn't moved from his spot, sweat dripping from his forehead. There was a faint scent of lemon and eucalyptus in the suite on the floor. A fruit plate was ready. Espresso capsules were neatly arranged. There was a card on the table with his initials written on it. It looked like it had been written in a hurry. Mark walked slowly around the room. He wasn't checking for cleanliness. His eyes searched for any sign that someone still cared about what he had built. Because this hotel wasn't just an investment, it was his personal story. When he was 33, giving a presentation in a bank meeting room in Minnesota, no one took him seriously. They didn't listen. Harsh loan terms had been imposed on him. They had implied he couldn't succeed. But here he was. He had succeeded. And now, nearly 20 years later, standing in one of the suites bearing his name, he still had to prove it. His phone vibrated. A message from his assistant. Everything is under control. Would you like to make a statement to the media? Mark paused. Of course, he could announce it to the public right away. One tweet, and the story would go viral. One interview, and it would be on the front page the next morning. But tonight, he wasn't interested in headlines. This wasn't about anger. This wasn't a story of revenge. This was about respect. And it was about how respect was often more tied to assumptions than to the truth. He sat down on the edge of the bed. His hands were on his knees, his head slightly bowed. Outside, the night was alive. The hum of Grand Avenue, the distant sound of a train. But in the suite, the air was heavy and silent. Then the door knocked. Room service. A young attendant brought a plate with fresh espresso, an apology note from the head chef, and a card stating that a massage therapist could be sent. Mark just smiled. Thank you, he said. He closed the door, sat down on the couch, and took a small sip of his espresso. He watched the city through the window, and he realized it wasn't just the hotel that was changing. Something had begun within him as well. At exactly 6 o'clock, Mark Ruffalo stepped out of the elevator. This time he wasn't a guest, but one of the owners. His dark gray suit was neatly pressed. Underneath, he wore a plain white shirt. He walked silently but with purpose. Each step exuded strength without drawing attention, and no one dared to step in his way. The lobby began to stir. Early departures, people grabbing their coffee, carrying their bags. But as soon as Mark appeared, everyone stopped. The staff stopped whispering. Even the barista in the corner paused the flow of coffee. Bren and Carlos were waiting by the fireplace with 3 files and 2 untouched cups of coffee. They had likely spent the night awake. Mark nodded slightly toward them. Then he headed straight for the small meeting room next to the reception desk. Brent followed closely behind. Carlos trailed a few steps behind. 3 people were waiting in the room: assistant manager Neil, receptionist Kayla Mendez, and a woman with a notebook who said she was from the company, Marta. They were all sitting down. Mark remained standing. Mark did not sit down. He stood at the head of the table, arms crossed, silent but determined. No one spoke at first. The room was enveloped in a thick silence. Then Mark spoke in a soft tone. Can I hear your perspective on what happened last night? Kayla immediately lowered her head. Neil cleared his throat, but no words came out. Mark waited. He didn't rush anyone. Finally, Kayla spoke in a whisper. I didn't think it was you. I didn't think someone like you would own the building. Mark finished her sentence for her. You weren't expecting it, were you? Kayla slowly shook her head. Did I treat you rudely? Mark asked. No. Did I raise my voice? No. Did I threaten anyone? Kayla could barely shake her head anymore. No, she said, her voice barely audible. Mark sighed. It was a deep but patient breath. There was no anger on his face, but there was the weariness of years. This doesn't have to be an execution, he said, but someone has to take responsibility. Marta nodded. I understand, she said professionally. Carlos interjected. An official report is being prepared. Kayla will be removed from the front desk until the certification process is complete. Neil will be suspended from duty until the administrative review is concluded. Mark nodded once. Then he finally sat down. He turned to Kayla. How long have you been here? 4 months. Did you ever think about it during that time? Who built this hotel? Who keeps it running? Kayla hesitated. I guess, a company, an investment group or something. Mark didn't miss her glance. Do you know how many properties I own in this country? Kayla shook her head. 17. From Baltimore to Phoenix. All meticulously designed. Luxurious, yet accessible. Service-oriented. Focused on people. Because after spending years in the shadows, I wanted to step out of them. His voice didn't rise. But when that final question came, there was nothing else in the room. And now tell me, when I walk into my own hotel, how do you think it feels to still not be seen by the people working there? The question wasn't angry, but it was tired, and it was brutally honest. Kayla was almost buried in her chair. Neil couldn't take his eyes off the table. Carlos spoke up. Today, an internal memo will be sent to all Oakmark properties. Mandatory inclusivity training will begin. No exceptions. Mark turned to him. Don't let this be a formality. I don't want them to memorize a script. I want them to understand what respect looks like, even when no one is watching. Brent spoke for the first time. It will be done. I promise. Mark nodded. Then he stood up silently. The meeting was over. As he left the conference room, there was a brief commotion in the lobby. Staff members were hurriedly nodding and greeting each other, but Mark didn't make eye contact with anyone. Not yet. He wasn't interested in that performance. He was looking for real change, and before leaving the hotel, there was one more conversation he needed to have. This wasn't about politics or corporate procedures. He waited until the morning rush had died down. This wasn't about making a dramatic impact. It was about making sure no one hid behind the crowd. In one of those brief moments when the phones weren't ringing and fake smiles gave way to reality, Mark glanced into the staff room behind the coffee bar. Kayla Mendez was there. She was sitting alone at a small table. In front of her was a half-eaten wild berry cake and a phone lying face down. Her face looked tired. Mark didn't send anyone else. He walked in himself. Kayla startled. She quickly stood up, nearly spilling her cup. Calm down, Mark said. He pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. I just want to talk. Kayla swallowed hard. Yes, Mr. Ruffalo. Mark shook his head slightly. Don't say that. This isn't an interview. He paused. It's not an interrogation either. Kayla lowered her head, her eyes fixed on the floor. There was a moment of silence. The hum of the refrigerator blended with the faint buzz of the fluorescent light on the ceiling. Then Mark spoke. Have you ever worked in a job that made you feel small? Kayla blinked. Then she lifted her head slightly. Yes, many times. Tell me about it. She paused for a moment, then shrugged her shoulders. I worked at a restaurant on the side of the I-80 highway for a year. I wore a paper hat. The chefs yelled at me. Some customers didn't even tip. Some called me kid. I was 27 years old, but most days, I felt invisible. Mark leaned back. So, you know what it's like to be ignored. Kayla nodded. Yes. Then, help me. Help me understand. Her voice was soft. Last night, when you looked into my eyes, how did you think I didn't belong here? The room fell silent again, but this time it wasn't an empty silence. It was a silence weighed down by guilt. Kayla's voice was shaky. I don't know. I mean, I didn't mean it like that. When you walked in, you looked a little lost, like you were waiting for someone else. Kayla seemed unable to hold back. She shook her head, but that head movement, it wasn't like someone acknowledging a guest, but more like someone acknowledging the hotel owner. Mark didn't flinch. He asked calmly, so what do those kinds of people look like? Kayla didn't answer. Mark continued, that's the problem. People have an image in their heads. Clean-shaven, probably wearing a suit, probably a man, old, and definitely not me. This image isn't just in your head. It influences your decisions and shapes your behavior. Kayla almost whispered, I'm sorry, I really am. I know it's not enough, but I ... Mark shook his head slightly. It's a start, but I didn't come here to get an apology. I want you to see me not just as your boss, not as a cautionary tale, but as a human being. Kayla looked stunned. Mark moved a little closer and smiled. I used to be just like you. I started out as a receptionist. I can't even count how many times I was mistaken for a janitor. People would call me buddy, dad, kid. Every time I had to decide whether to respond or just swallow it. And finally, when I made it to the board of directors, I made a promise to myself. I'll create places where people like you can grow. Kayla's eyes were wide now. Really? You were a receptionist? Mark smiled, bowing his head. At St. Paul's. My first boss put me on night duty because I spoke too nicely on the phone. That's how it all started. Kayla was almost smiling. This can't be real. It shouldn't be, Mark said without looking away. It should be. And it should be normal. I don't want you to be perfect, but I want you to be aware. Every guest who walks through that door, old, young, stylish, or ordinary, deserves respect. Start there, and you'll never have to escape a scene like last night again. Kayla stood up. Thank you for talking to me. Sincerely. Mark nodded once and silently left the room. As he headed toward the living room door, something inside him felt lighter, because he knew the message had been received. By mid-morning, Oakmark Grand had found its rhythm again. Guests were dragging their suitcases across the polished tiles. Coffee cups were clinking at the coffee bar, and a small family was asking about the nearby zoo. On the surface, everything seemed normal, but something had changed inside. Everything looked normal from the outside, but inside the management office, the atmosphere was completely different. Brent was standing by the window. He watched the valet park cars in an orderly fashion. Carlos was quietly preparing official memos on his laptop. Human Resources Manager Marta was reviewing new hiring modules with a blank expression, and at the head of the table, Mark Ruffalo was sitting. In front of him, a thick stack of marked personnel files. He was going through them one by one, reading every note carefully. He wasn't angry. He was just meticulous. I'm not here to punish anyone, he said aloud, setting a report aside. I'm here to prevent it from happening again. Carlos looked up. We're changing the interview system for receptionists. It will include not just skills, but empathy and test for biases and preconceptions. Mark nodded in agreement. Good. He tapped his pen on the desk once. And me? Put me on rotation starting next quarter. Brent looked up, his eyebrows raising slightly. Are you going to be a mystery guest? Not secret, just, my name won't be mentioned when I'm with Carlos, Mark said with a slight smile. Brent smiled slightly as well. That'll make quite a few people nervous. Good. Let them be nervous, because the real face of this business doesn't show itself until after the warnings. Mark stood up as he placed the files in a folder. Have the new training program ready by Friday? Include the story modules. The staff should read the actual experiences of real guests, not written scripts. Real words. Human words. Brent nodded. I'll take care of it. Mark left the office and started walking toward the lobby. A new staff member was behind the reception desk. He recognized him immediately and smiled respectfully. Mark nodded in response. He glanced around for a moment. Everything seemed normal from the outside, but inside small cracks were beginning to form in the routines, and Mark could feel it, because real change doesn't start with press releases or apologies made on stage. Real change begins with quiet adjustments, repeated until they become habits. He walked toward the elevator. He was going upstairs to get his things. His flight was late in the afternoon. When the elevator doors opened on his floor, he stepped out slowly. His footsteps left soft imprints on the carpet. The corridor smelled of fresh sheets and lemon. The suite door was ajar. The cleaning staff must have finished their work. He stepped inside. His bag was neatly packed, the zipper closed. His laptop was on the desk. The charger was neatly wrapped. Everything was in its place, except for one thing, a folded note on the nightstand. Mark picked it up. It was a simple lined piece of paper. There was no fancy envelope, just a few words written neatly and carefully. Mr. Ruffalo, thank you for your kindness. Kayla, I'll be okay. Mark folded the note once. He placed it in the inner pocket of his jacket and took a deep breath. Because that piece of paper was far more real than the company's pre-written apology templates. Far more meaningful. A car was waiting for him downstairs. As he exited the lobby, The doorman he had met the previous night opened the door with a different energy. "Have a safe trip, Mr. Ruffalo," he said sincerely. "We hope to see you again." Mark smiled slightly. "See you," he said simply. And as the car pulled away from the curb, he didn't look back. He didn't need to, because he had left something behind, something heavier than his suitcase. The weight of misunderstanding, the silent exhaustion of having to explain his own worth. What replaced it was a deeper understanding. Perhaps for them, perhaps for himself. But inside Mark, there was still something he wanted to say. Not to the hotel, not to the staff or the managers. It was for everyone in this world who had to prove over and over again that they belonged. The road to the airport was quiet. The driver didn't speak. The radio was on, but the volume was turned down. There was only the sound of tires on asphalt and the occasional flash of a signal light. Mark sat in the back seat. One hand was in his bag. The other was still holding the small note Kayla had left. He hadn't read it again, but it was there. Like a reminder, like a small sign proving that everything hadn't been in vain that night. He looked out the window, rows of brick buildings, the old gas station on the corner, the faded repair shop signs, and he thought, maybe it wasn't a coincidence that he was here this week. He hadn't planned to be here this week, but maybe he was supposed to be here all along. Not for the board meeting, not for the business follow-up, to talk, to show. Because the truth was, things like this didn't surprise him anymore. He wasn't angry about it, but he was tired of it being constant. He was tired of value being measured by assumptions. He was tired of people labeling him without asking, without understanding, without looking. He was tired of having to explain things he shouldn't have to say out loud. Yes, this is me. Yes, I built this building. Yes, I deserve to be here. But he wasn't suffering. That was the part people couldn't understand. Mark Ruffalo wasn't suffering. He was just carrying memories. And memories, when used correctly, are powerful enough to silently move mountains. When the airport signs came into view, he thought of himself as a young man, working night shifts in a cheap apartment, unmade up, unrecognizable, but repeating one sentence over and over in his head. One day, I will build something no one can take away from me. He had achieved that. But buildings weren't enough, because even though he owned 17 properties and had an army of employees, people still looked at him and saw less than that. So, what do you do when the world ignores you? You take a hard look at yourself. You don't apologize. And you keep going. You don't budge. You speak clearly. And you never beg for permission. You act as if the door has always been yours. Mark got out of the car. He took his bag. He nodded to the driver. No words were needed. People were rushing around the terminal. Coffee cups, wheeled suitcases, loud announcements. But he moved through the crowd silently. He was almost invisible. But there was something heavy and steady in his chest. The humiliation he had suffered that night had turned into a mirror. And mirrors don't lie. They show you who you really are. He hoped Kayla would learn something from this, that Neil would learn his lesson, that Carlos and Brent would keep their promises, but even if they didn't, he would still be standing, because honor was not something anyone gave him. It was something he never gave up. And now to all those who watched, listened, were ignored, met with suspicion, and taken lightly, there was one last thing Mark Ruffalo had to say. You don't have to shout to be heard. Just know who you are, and always act like it. Let them be uncomfortable. Let them learn. Let them realize for themselves how they let you slip away. And when they finally see you, never forget. If this story stirred something in you, if it made you pause and think, if it touched you deeply, then share it, leave a comment, and stay with us for more stories that speak of strength, respect, and silent resistance. Subscribe.